If there's one thing we know about unions in the Bahamas, if there's ever a good time to strike, they sure know how to pick it. From equal wages to equal work to better working conditions, regulated work time, and even fair benefits, we all have the labor movement and the work of tireless union representatives to thank for the tremendous strides made in the country. You're watching On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Long before independence, the labor movement in the Bahamas was carried by a courageous group of Bahamians who were instrumental in securing the racial, financial, and economic freedoms which we all enjoy. And there are many who don't know of what Labor Day really means to us. For some, it still remains a passion, and we call those people union representatives. Tonight on The Record, we deliberate on the state of unions and, by extension, labor in our country, some 60 years since the passage of legislation to constitute Labor Day as a public holiday. Stay tuned. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break. Every new season of On the Record, we push the limits, venture into unknown territory, take our cameras into places unseen before. We share the stories and experiences that affect us all. And now it's time for Season 5. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on RTV, cable channel 212, and streaming live on Facebook. Welcome back to On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer, and tonight we are discussing the state of unions. Where are we now? The late Sir Randall Fox, also referred to as the father of labor, is the patron of our annual Labor Day celebrations as a result of the work he did in establishing the trade union movement in the Bahamas. This year, the Bahamas celebrates the diamond anniversary of the years of the passage of legislation to constitute Labor Day as a public holiday. Here to discuss this year's theme and address the state of our unions is Quinton LaRoda, Area Vice President of the Bahamas Union of Teachers Northern Region, as well as the 4th Vice President of the National Congress of Trade Unions of the Bahamas. Welcome to On the Record, sir. I want to start by talking about some of the major issues that you believe unions are facing in the Bahamas today.
Yeah, I mean, there's several major issues. One of them, I think, can be addressed by legislations. But the industrial tribunal inability to enforce its own rulings is a major setback to the labor movement. Because if an employer violates an industrial agreement, even the average worker is mistreated by an employer, and you go through the tribunal process and you win the case, a lot of the employers still don't abide by the ruling. And then you have to go to the Supreme Court to have the ruling enforced. So I think there should be some amendment to where even if you say that any award under $20,000 could be enforced by the tribunal and so forth. In order to get a tribunal ruling overturned, you have to go to the appeals court. So the tribunal is equal to the Supreme Court in terms of its weight, but the inability to enforce it is a major challenge to the labor movement, unions and workers on the whole. One of the other things, admittedly, the labor movement sometimes is starting to seem to be out of touch with the average citizen at times, and the appreciation for the labor movement is not there the way it once was, and it's something that we in the labor movement have to address. Because the thing about unionism is the more you fight and you gain for the worker and for the average individual, the less they need the union. So unions have to, in a constant struggle for relevance and importance, but you cannot tell the story of the modern Bahamas without the labor movement. And every Bahamian needs to be reminded of that. And Labor Day is set aside for special attention and special focus so that the entire country can be reminded that without the labor movement, there's no majority rule, there's no independence, there's no maternity leave, there's no overtime pay. All these benefits that the average Bahamian take for granted, all these civil liberties we enjoy were gained in the back of the labor movement. And so I think we now need to engage the public a bit more and the young people a bit more to let them know, those who don't know, and to remind those who have forgotten that the labor movement's role in the Bahamas development is pivotal, it's eternal, and we must ensure that labor remains respected now and going forward into the future.
I want to springboard off of something you said about the importance of remaining relevant. It would seem that we hear from unions every time that there is a dispute or there's something you are speaking out against. Can you provide us with some things that, or help us to understand how the union affects workers outside of those times of dispute, or the things that happen on an ordinary basis that we do not hear about, that you admittedly said that you can do a better job of telling us about? Help us to understand why the union remains relevant to us today.
Well, one of the things that unions do is training and improving the education and the skill set of the average worker. There are many unions who have pension plans that their members benefit from. So when they retire, in addition to what they would get from the employer, the union has a pension scheme to assist them as well. We have unions who have healthcare plans that provide benefit for their members as well, outside that provided by the employer. So unions are involved in some very good work. Unions have relief programs for their members when they're facing things like devastation from hurricanes, family death, small emergencies. Unions assist with all of these things. When we get depressed, it's mostly when there's a dispute with an employer, and that's the time also we try to make the public aware of the dispute, so that there's pressure, even in sentiment from the Bahamian people, against an employer who would mistreat a worker. And so I think we could do a better job at PR to let the public know that outside of us just advocating vociferously in the public for our members, that we do things and we do treat our members well, and members have benefit, and it's in their interest to be a part of our unions.
How has COVID-19 and all of the things that have come along with it impacted work and the effectiveness of even unions at this point?
Yeah, COVID-19 has created challenges. And so even when we come out of the pandemic, we're going to find that businesses that once had 10 employees, because of the advance in technology, may only need 5. And so we have to look at that, learn from that, and try to see how best through training or new approach or incorporating the technology ourselves, that we could keep the level of employment up, or we could have our members prepared for new avenues of employment based on the new technologies. It's something that I've always been concerned about. While I appreciate technology, if the guy could now have someone order something online, drive your business and pick it up, the delivery boy could be out of a job and he could be a member of your union. So we must adapt to the new technology, and COVID has brought that to the forefront. But the civil liberties lost during the pandemic, I think, is a great challenge as well. Trying to regain them once the pandemic has passed may be a challenge, and I'm looking forward to coming back to that sense of normalcy with the ability to assemble freely and move freely.
Before we wrap up this segment, I want to ask, what is the status of your Labor Day activities? I know last year there were no parades. I know you all were attempting to do some things this year. What's the status of your celebrations this year?
Well, as I was coming on the air, I received a correspondence from the Commissioner of Police saying that those of us who are planning parades, those parades are not allowed. Our thought was that we usually march on Labor Day here in the North. And we know because of COVID and the social distancing, a march was a bad idea. So we thought the perfect solution would be a motorcade, where you're in your cars, you're more than 6 feet apart, you're riding with your friend or your family or people from your household. And when we give the Labor Day speeches, that you would sit in your car. And so there would be, the chances of transmission would be greatly decreased going that route. And so we wrote the commissioner, the deputy commissioner here in Grand Bahama, that we usually write. We were told to write to Nassau. I've just been informed that the permission to do that can only come from the competent authority. And that's why there's a challenge now with trying to have this parade in the morning. And so I'm going to call an emergency meeting with the other union leaders here, because we have to find a way now to address it. I know some people would say, let's still go ahead with it. But I believe that there has to be a level of responsibility. If you're going to decide to go ahead with it, then the workers you're inviting out must be aware that there may be consequences legal in nature. I'm not one who leads blindly. And so I believe we must act responsibly. Mm-hmm. And then we could use our ingenuity and our creativity to find other ways to get the same thing done that a motorcade would have done.
Gwyn Lorota, thank you very much. A good, responsible stance as well. I mean, we may not always agree, but the law is there and we must all abide by the law. And as you said, if you don't, there are consequences, like it or not. Sir, thank you very much for joining us. We do appreciate you spending this time with us. Certainly, there are always issues related to the trade union movement that we can address. So again, thank you very much. When we return, we we continue our conversation on the state of unions with those who lead in academia. Stay tuned. Every new season of On the Record, we push the limits, venture into unknown territory, take our cameras into places unseen before. We share the stories and experiences that affect us all. And now it's time for Season 5. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on RTV, cable channel 212, and streaming live on Facebook. Welcome back. You're watching On the Record, and tonight we are discussing the state of the unions. And this year's Labor Week theme is Labor Rights Ultimately Triumph Over Wrongful Might. My guest for this segment is Dr. Christopher Curry, Associate Professor of History at the University of the Bahamas, and Daniel Thompson, President of the Union of Tertiary Educators of the Bahamas, as well as an Assistant Professor of Management and Marketing at the University of the Bahamas. These esteemed gentlemen, welcome to On the Record. Glad to have you with us. Dr. Curry, I'm going to start with you in your role as an historian. Help us to understand really what labor relations were like prior to Burma Road riots and the proper establishment of the labor movement in this country.
Well, in a nutshell, it was horrible because you didn't have any labor laws. There was rampant exploitation. If you read any of the work by Howard Johnson and other noted scholars, we understand that we really had a wageless society up until the 1920s with the truck credit and share system operating in such a way that the Nassau merchant class was able to extract the labor of the black masses without actually having to pay them. And so only with the advent of prohibition and bootlegging do we have really wage labor being offered, but then there's no unions. The first union that we know of is established actually in Anagua just before the Anagua riot of 1937. And then, of course, by 1942, with the Burma Road Riot, you do have now the Bahamas Federation of Labor. But understand that, generally speaking, there were no minimum wages. There were no standard practices as it relates to arbitration, and wage earning potential had to be done at the whim of the master class, the Nassau merchant class. And really, even after the Burma Road riot, the rioters only received the 2-shilling wage increase after all of that. And there still wasn't any regulations guiding collective bargaining and the right to unionize. So it isn't until after the 1958 general strike those sort of things start to come into place. So we really had a long history in which exploitation was the order of the day.
Mr. Thompson, clearly we have come a long way in our labor relations and even our treatment of workers in the country, even now the establishment of things like the Industrial Tribunal. But where are we, or are we at a place where we should be when it comes to the state of labor in our country? Looking at all the strides we've made over all of these decades, are we still at a place where our workers are receiving the proper benefits and the proper attention that they should be receiving?
I think in many respects the situation that Dr. Curry described, although not at that extreme, I think in many respects I think there needs to be an appreciation for the role of human capital in business, the importance of human capital. There ought to be greater respect for workers, and there ought to be a proper understanding of the tripartite relationship that exists with the workers, the government, and the employer. And so sometimes a lot of the issues that we currently experience today are really as a result of not appreciating the role that workers play and not seeing them as an integral part of any business development.
Okay, so if we let's sort of examine this sort of tripartite association that you spoke of. What is the role of government in protecting workers? Because you've got private companies that are operating private businesses that have workers. I just want to take the government out of the mix for a moment, and even the quasi-government. But you're asking, or you know, people look to the government to intervene in labor matters that seem to be of those affairs of the private company and the employees. Where does the government fit into that? And it really is it the government's place to tell me as a businessman how I should be operating?
Well, the government provides the environment and the type of support, for example, when there are labor complaints, ensuring that issues that are sent to the Department of Labor for consideration are dealt with in a timely manner and appropriately. In addition to that, the labor movement has always had a concern about the role of the Industrial Tribunal and its inability to implement and enforce much of its rulings. And so these things are in the domain of the government to put greater teeth to the Industrial Tribunal so that when decisions are made, that they're able to enforce it. Those are political decisions that the government can make. And while the government may not be the entity in place then, nonetheless, they control the entire machinery of labor relationship. In addition to that, when we look at foreign direct investment and the involvement of non-Bahamian entities, it becomes more critical. They're heads of agreements. There are certain conditions under which foreign direct investors come into the country, and the government of the day has a lot of influence over how these institutions or these organizations, these businesses operate.
Dr. Curry, a lot of times we hear People, we hear the cries, we hear people speaking out against injustices, against workers, even saying that in some instances we see a repeat of history where there's unequal pay for equal work, discrimination, even unsavory working environments. Do we see that, or is this sort of a new manifestation that we are seeing with all of these complaints in the workplace?
Well, let me start by quoting Martin Luther King, who said, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. So I don't think whether we're talking about 1942 or 2021, we should somehow make it a sideline issue. It should be front and center in our thinking about wages and laborers. And I would say that in the immediate post-independence period, there was the growth of a middle class in the Bahamas. I think that extended into the early 80s. But I will tell you that particularly since FTAA and the banking regulations that were implemented shortly after, their pressure put on us, and then with Francis and Jean, and then, of course, the global recession of around 2008, and now a pandemic and Dorian, we have definitely seen the eroding of a middle class, and we're into a rugged period of economic recession. And that has had direct impact on our laboring classes. And I would argue that we are definitely in a place of vulnerability. And we're in a place where we have an expanding gulf and divide between the haves and the have-nots in our country. And this has direct bearing on how we relate to the laboring class. One of the things I would echo, just speaking in the context of what Brother Thompson just said, we must never forget that the greatest asset a country has is its human capital, its people. And so when we're in a scarce environment, in a recessional environment, we always have to look to the poor and the downtrodden first. And even beyond that, we must look to our Bahamian people first. All right? So the time of incentivizing and giving to the foreign and foreign direct investor, I think needs to be in the dustbin of history.
Interesting. Mr. Thompson, I want your take on that. How do we begin to close that gulf that that Dr. Curry speaks of, or what do we do to try and rescue that middle class, which really has been the backbone of our economy? And one of the things that we've always been so proud of is the strength of our middle class in this country. When you compare it to even other countries in the region, but what can we do to begin to rescue that middle class? And I'm talking from a governmental as well as from an employer's perspective.
Well, yes, I agree that the middle class is a critical part for any economic recovery program. And we're going to be faced with a big challenge because we have lost and we have eroded so much of the influence of our middle class. And so what government must do and what the private sector must do are these type of things. The government must ensure that the middle class, in terms of business development and those who are engaged in entrepreneurship, that they are supported in a very smooth and simple fashion. I think gone are the days when they're talking about what they plan on doing and about these great economic policies, and when you look on the ground, there's really nothing happening. There's a lot of political patronage taking place as opposed to providing policies that affect the average man on the street. The private sector, on the other hand, has to appreciate that during the good times, they were able to generate significant amount of profit. So perhaps the shortcoming that exists today. And that goes back to the concept of the human capital. The business cannot exist without human component. And while we invest in buildings and other structures, we must similarly invest in training our persons, our workers, retraining them, and providing them with acceptable remuneration. Traditionally, from business schools, most persons are taught that you want to reach a point of maximization where you're able to reduce wages as much as possible and other expenses. Well, we need to turn that model on its head. That if you want to increase your profitability, you need to do it by enhancing not just the infrastructure of the business, but you must take care of your human capital and thereby increasing productivity. So productivity becomes the word of the day, that by recognizing and appreciating the workers, you end up with a worker that is very productive, that can now increase your profitability. So it ties back into profitability if workers are respected and celebrated.
It certainly is a great argument for improving conditions in the workplace. We are in an unprecedented era. Dr. Curry, I'm going to start with you. The whole COVID-19 pandemic has changed the landscape of how we work, where we work, our level of productivity. I can tell you, even from my perspective, working from home, it's like I seem to start earlier and I seem to end so much later. It's almost, a perpetual, never-ending workday. But historically, what are some of your projections on how this is going to, this whole pandemic and working from home and all of the things that we are facing? How do you think this is going to change the workplace permanently going forward? And do you see any disadvantage for workers?
When I look back through the portals of the past at other seminal moments in world history, whether it be the Spanish flu after World War I, or the Wall Street crash in 1929 that led to the Great Depression, one of the things that we see is these events take a long time to play out. So if we're expecting instantaneous change for us to go back to the way things were, to a normal life, then we need to prepare ourselves for a longer journey. And I'm guessing that this is going to be at least another 2 or 3 years. I'm anxious to leave the island to go on a vacation. I'm thinking about a cruise or even to travel to Orlando, as I used to do every Easter for many years. That is not going to happen, at least in terms of regular contact without masks and all of that. Although you'll get the 2 vaccinations and people will be able to travel more loosely, I think the fear of this COVID is going to have a more lasting dent, especially when you think about the economies. And think about this, in 2008, when we had that global recession because of the banking issues in the United States and elsewhere, that remained transient in the Bahamas for at least another 2 or 3 years, the ripple effects of that recession. So I'm imagining, even as we see the U.S. opening up and travel restrictions starting to be relieved, I'm suggesting the economic side of the pandemic is going to take another 2 or 3 years to be resolved. And while you may start to see some signs of improvement right away with employment figures, some of that may be illusionary because that's making up for a huge deficit that we've been dealing with for the last year and a half. So to look at a healthy economy, you need to see about 4 to 5% GDP growth. And you need to see new businesses being open, not just the old ones that are coming back online. But I want to see the growth measurement for me is the number of new businesses that are opening. And that's going to be another 2 or 3 years, I believe.
Mr. Thompson, as we begin to reopen, as Dr. Curry would have alluded to, and people start going back to work and hopefully the economy begins to improve, there will be a natural propensity for people to want more, to ask for more jobs, pay increases, those kinds of things. Where does the balance come in? Because businesses are going to push back and say, listen, we were shut down, we've been operating at a loss, we have this ground to make up, we just can't do it. And by businesses, whether it's the hotels, government itself, smaller businesses, conglomerates, whatever, what do you expect to be, or where do we find that balance between what the workers want and need, as well as what the business owners can afford to do?
Jerome, first of all, trade unionists are rational beings, and notwithstanding the posturing trade unionism is the ability to sit in the boardroom, to engage in dialogue and discussions and find remedies to ensure the sustainability of the organization. Because one thing that we trade unionists know, that if the business cannot survive as a going entity, then our jobs are gone. I see, for an example, what is happening at the University of the Bahamas, of which Brother Chris is one of our members at UTR. We have had to sit with the management and find ways in which we can reduce expenses to ensure that the university is an ongoing concern. And faculty overwhelmingly agreed to provide certain provisions. And this is what's going to happen for every business that returns when we return to business. We must sit down at the table. And that's one of the problems that I mentioned earlier. There must be respect for workers, that we can bring them in and sit down and discuss the affairs of the enterprise, as opposed to just giving dictates and saying that we're going to do this, we're going to do that, without dialogue. And many times, much of the problems that businesses have with labor unions is their inability to dialogue and to engage in discourse.
Well, Mr. Thompson, I do want to challenge something you said, and I'm going to challenge it from the public's perspective. You referred to labor leaders as being rational individuals. From what we see in the public and even in the media, it's, there's always a threat of action, or there's always a threat of something. And what we don't see, as you may have mentioned, is that lack of dialogue. But sometimes I find that the public really has no appetite for some of the actions that we see, or some of the calls that come from the union. Why do you think that is? And what's happened? Because it always seems to me at the end of the day that the union and the workers are the ones who are seen to be irrational in some cases. But how is it that we get to that point where the public goes, wait a minute, how do we arrive at this point?
Again, it goes to that tripartite relationship and respect for each entity. For the organization or for the employer, it is to his advantage to make the union appear to be very adversarial and very energetic, trying to destroy the country. That's to his advantage. And so when a union has to engage in any trade dispute action that the public sees, be mindful that they are out there because the organization, the government, or the employer refuses to sit and talk. Jerome, there are some trade unions that have not met with their employer for years. They have not sat down at the table. At the University of the Bahamas, for example, I sit every week with the president to discuss issues. We still have our challenges at times, but the fact is we're able to solve a lot of issues through dialogue. And it's basic, simple dialoguing, discussing, even in the midst of our differences. If we keep those channels of communication open with the government, with the employer, then there's a greater chance that they will succeed. There's less need for the outbursts that the public sees. But when that happens, we must not just blame the labor unions, we must also point our fingers to the employer and to the government. Someone has not done their work. When two people are rowing in the street and carrying on, you do not blame one of them. It's because they did not engage in discourse behind closed door. So it's a two-way blame.
Profound words, Mr. Thompson.
Communication.
You are quite right, and I think that's the part that we miss sometimes as the public. I'm just amazed to hear you say that the years have gone by and employers are not talking to trade unions. That's insanity as far as I'm concerned. Before we wrap up, Dr. Curry, this is for you. How do we continue to tell the story of the labor movement to generations who are unfamiliar or don't know or seemingly don't care? I mean, when I asked someone on my team, do you know why Labor Day is named after Sir Randall Fox? He said, I think so. And I had to quickly tell that story. But how do we keep that story going or make it relevant so people understand the role of the labor movement, not just as Mr. Thompson said, to get in the road and row and carry on when things go wrong, but how do we keep that story going so people understand, the generations understand and appreciate it the way that my parents and grandparents did?
I have three suggestions. The first one is we need to have a comprehensive history of the labor movement written sooner than later. I think the story needs to be told. It's all good for Brother Thompson and I to come on your show and talk about it, but there needs to be something more substantive in terms of a written record that people can go to and read. So that's my first point. Secondly,
that's not just interwoven into the politics, because I think that's where it happens as well.
This would be a comprehensive history of the labor movement written by independent researchers, not allied to a labor movement group or party affiliate or anything like that, but a group of scholars who would be taken to the task of doing this. The second thing I would say is we need to digitize a lot of our documents that our young people can then have access to. You know, a lot of times young people are on Facebook and other social medias, and they don't always get to see the documents that are so prescient, so important to our country's history as it relates to labor. So digitizing documents and making them accessible on platforms that youth use is really important. And then my third suggestion is the curriculum itself. Our schools need to implement more of the history of the labor movement to talk about the struggles of people like Sir Randall Fawkes, but also talk about the less known figures like someone like Sam Stubbs, who was essentially Sir Randall Fawkes' right-hand man. He was his senior advisor. And this man he's still alive. He's 91 years old, and he's a hero of the labor movement, and yet we know so little about him. He served essentially as the Secretary General to Sir Randall, and he has received some recognition, but not enough. There's lots of others like him. And so I think we need to get it into the schools and in the curriculum to a more substantive level than it is currently.
Great idea, and as a good way for us to end. If we do not know our history, we certainly are bound to repeat the mistakes of the past. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. Dr. Christopher Curry, Mr. Daniel Thompson, thank you for coming and imparting some good knowledge on us here this evening, and certainly giving us a lot to think about, and hopefully putting more of what the labor union does and what it's about into perspective, so that we have understanding. I think far too often we just don't understand some things in our country, which causes us to make some rash decisions or some wrong decisions. Gentlemen, thank you so very much, and happy Labor Day to you. Don't go anywhere. When we come back, we continue our discussions with some union representatives that make up the National Congress of Trade Unions. We're back right after this. Every new season of On the Record, we push the limits, venture into unknown territory, take our cameras into places unseen before. We share the stories and experiences that affect us all. And now it's time for Season 5. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on RTV, cable channel 212, and streaming live on Facebook. Welcome back to On the Record. Our discussion continues tonight, the state of the unions. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. As always, thanks for staying with us. Penned in the journals of the late Sir Randall Fawkes, the father of labor in our country, is evil works can never prevail. Light will always show up darkness. This is the premise of this year's theme. Labor rights ultimately triumphs over wrongful. Might is extracted. My guest for this segment of the show is Robert Farquharson, the Executive Manager of the Ministry of Labour and Chairman of the National Tripartite Council, as well as President of the Women's Branch of the National Congress of Trade Unions, Ms. Sharon Martin. Welcome to On the Record. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to dive right in and talk about the state that we find ourselves in. In the early onset of the pandemic, we heard loud cries from Atlanta's workers asking to be made redundant so that they can get their funds rightfully owed to them. Now that we are seeing this and the way it's played out with deferred payments and even banks holding funds, was this the best move for our workers, even as they were agitating for it so early on, and then now for it actually to happen and have all these people out of work?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, you go ahead, sir.
Well, Jerome, I would have made some public statements when the cry was made by those hotel workers to demand redundancy, is that they need to be very careful what they ask for, because they just might get it. And today we see the company has taken the decision to make 700 plus employees redundant. The terms in which they were made redundant are, in my opinion, inconsistent with the laws of the Bahamas, and it raises some serious concern for us at the National Tripartite Council. The concept of social dialogue should have been engaged, whereby the employers, the employees, and the government could have come to the table and discussed all of the issues surrounding the redundancy. Section 27 of the 2017 Employment Amendment Act makes provisions that redundancy payments are made at the time of redundancy. That does not mean 3 months later. That means at the time of redundancy. So the position that Atlantis has taken is in violation of the statute laws of the Bahamas. And that's a problem. If Atlantis did not have sufficient funds to make persons redundant all at once, they should have taken the steps to make a certain group redundant, pay them off in accordance with the law, then make another group redundant, pay them off in accordance with the law. It is inconsistent with the laws of the Bahamas that Atlantis has taken the position to make employees redundant and not pay them at the time of redundancy. And that's going to set a trend in this country. We have to be extremely careful not to make sure no other employers does the same thing, Jerome.
So Sharon Martin, what's next? What does what recourse do those employees have, and what is the union's role, and what should be the government's role in all of this if we're talking about this tripartite scenario?
Well, Jerome, first of all, the government should have set the pace as the protector of the rights of the people. And when we see that been breached, even from the standpoint of us asking about the time limit that the government said that they had, or even to say to us, show us on the table where the paperwork has been brought into the Ministry of Labor, and that paperwork would have been recognized by the workers' reps, which would be the hotel union president, and whoever sat at the table. We have not seen that. We have not heard that has happened. We have heard vis-a-vis our president's conversation with the minister that he was working with these persons, hoteliers, several weeks, and so the 30 days was not breached. But I'm from Missouri. I'm from the Show Me State, and I have not seen where the Ministry of Labor has been able to produce or show that this in fact happened and that the breach did not happen. In fact, in terms for where we move forward, the people need their monies. Okay, how Atlantis works out getting the people their money. No one should be accepting any ASU draw. That is not what this is. This is not my ASU draw. This is give me my money. That is what I'm entitled to. If the government allows Atlantis to break the law now, as Chairman Farquharson alluded to, who else is going to come behind? Precedent has been set, and we cannot allow that.
So I would think that this is where the union, and the labor movement in the country comes into force. What are you all doing to ensure that, as you said, the law is not broken, these people are given their money as they should be, and to make sure that this is not the norm going forward? What is the union's role and the labor movement's role? Because let's be honest, today is Atlantis, tomorrow can be someone else, another union, another industry.
Well, I wear several hats, and so one of them is the Tripartite Council. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sharon. The president of the Hotel Catering and Other Workers Union, who is a member of the National Congress Trade Union Bahamas, has entered into discussions, I am advised, with the Atlantis property to try and have that matter resolved. But the council itself, Section 3 of the National Tripartite Council Act, says that this National Tripartite Council is a forum for labor and industrial relations in the Bahamas. And so the National Tripartite Council will take the lead in this matter and be proactive and say to large employers in particular, if you have some issues regarding the manner in which redundancies are set out in our country, that's what we are there for. Let's sit around the bargaining table. Let's sit around the table into the concept of social dialogue. Let's discuss these issues. Let's identify all of the things that has to be done, and let's systematically determine what's the best way to have this done to make sure this is not repeated in our country.
So Sharon, in the meantime, what's happening with the employees as this now plays out? People still don't have their monies. I mean, what are we saying to the employees as well?
Well, until the hotel union gets with their people, there's pretty much nothing that the Congress can do at this point, until they work out the individual issue. There's really, your hands are kind of tied until that happens.
So I want to use this opportunity to turn the camera a bit back onto you all. One of the concerns that a lot of citizens would have had with unions over the past few months is that while they were furloughed, the employees were furloughed, unions, as they say, didn't give the assistance that was needed. I need you to respond to that. And if it's not true, then let's talk about what was given and whether that was comparable to what they needed.
Jerome, I think that persons had an expectation of delivery on, I guess, cash or goods or whatever. I don't think that that is a fair assessment of the expectations that would have led to the disappointments. But there are unions, and I know that most of the major unions, if not all of the unions that I'm aware of, that they reached out to those persons who needed the help. I know you would have seen in the media, the hotel union, for example, those long lines. So, a picture paints 1,000 words. So that attests to the fact that help was given. I know that BUT, for example, that the teachers were assisted, and several other unions that have come forward, and be it CPOU, packages were done. I am very well aware that these things were done. So no, that I would
Robert,
not say.
And I get you on that. It was important to bring it up. Robert, these were unprecedented times for the unions because the unions found themselves in a very difficult and different position. You being a trade unionist for so long, what was it like for the trade union movement, knowing that so many of your members were out of work in desperate times, and this is a time they really needed the trade union movement? What was it like to have to be able now to help the members who had been paying dues and been members for so long?
Yeah, Jerome, I agree with your concerns raised. I think trade unions should have been more proactive. They should have utilized the process of social media. They should have, I'm sorry, not social media, the process of social dialogue. Let me give you a prime example. The Bahamas Hotel Employees Association has a very lucrative pension fund. Many of the unions itself have pension funds, have other funds that are available. I wished that there could have been a situation where the social partners, that is the government, the employers, and the workers could come together around the table, identify what funds are available on these pension funds, and utilize some of those funds in exchange for concessions. The government could give the hotel concessions when the pandemic came to an end, in exchange for providing more assistance for the workers during the 14, 15 months that they were furloughed. It was not the fault of the workers or the employers. The employers themselves had much difficulty because they wasn't able to generate a revenue to sustain giving the employees any kind of assistance. So it should have been a system whereby the three of the social partners come together, identify what concessions the hotel could have used on the rebound, living in a COVID-19 environment, and then use those concessions to offset some funding to give those workers more benefits during the redundancy period.
And I to your point, Sharon Martin, I think while the food assistance was important, people needed so much more than food because there was no income, and people were dealing with so many more issues. But of course, that's a discussion, I would think that the trade unions and workers would take up after we've come past all of this. How do we protect our workers the next time something like this happens? I want to move forward with the discussion. We've seen a lot of companies around the country begin to request their employees show proof of negative rapid tests weekly in order to perform their duties at their own expense in the absence of full vaccination. This has raised some concerns with employees who say it seems that we are being forced to take a vaccine, or we're being disadvantaged by being asked to take these rapid tests at our own expense on a weekly basis. Your thoughts, your feedback.
Well, most certainly from the Congress position, we have point blankly said we reached out to the government. We reached out to the employers in particular, who first came out, with this biggity attitude to say that you had to do it. And the director of labor went on record to say that it was against the law for you to force anyone to do any vaccines or anything of the sort without them wanting to do it. So actually a no-brainer that if no one, it's against your rights. It's against, I'm going to say it very slowly, Jerome.
Well, I think we all agree with that no one can force you to take a vaccine. I think, and that's a given position, and I support you on that. The question is, though, the companies that are requiring their employees to take rapid tests and have put a deadline on when they will stop paying for those tests. So as of a certain date, the employees will now be responsible for absorbing the cost of their weekly rapid tests.
So Jerome Sawyer,
if it's in a unionized environment, are we hearing this in a non-unionized environment or in a unionized environment? Because if it's not in the industrial agreement, no one can be telling you what to do without first just sitting down with your workers' reps. And I think sometimes we miss that whole thing, that whole social dialogue aspect that Mr. Chairman just spoke about. Mr. Chair.
Jerome, I want to add to what Sharon is saying. Section 9 of the Health and Safety at Work Act reads as follows, Jerome. No employer shall levy or permit to be levied on any employee or face any charge in respect of anything done or provide in pursuance of any provisions of this act. It is against Section 9 of the Employment Act for the employer to request an employee to pay for those tests. That's a clear violation of the law. I don't care who the employer is. And if they try that, they will be in front of the courts in no time.
And so what then is the solution? And I'm talking from an employee's perspective. Let's take the hotel, for instance. When you've got vaccine hesitation that continues and you have a lot of people who won't, for whatever reason, come forward to be vaccinated, but you've got to also create and maintain a healthy work environment for those employees, but also for your guests. Where do we strike the balance? What does an employer do?
The balance is sought in the concept of social dialogue. And you're quite correct, Jerome. Section 4 of the Health and Safety at Work Act puts a burden on the employer to provide a safe working environment for its employees. Section 5 provides that the employer provides a safe working environment for people not an employee, being his customers, the guests. However, there are some constitutional issues as well. How do you solve the problem? You sit around the table, you discuss the issues, and you come to an amicable resolution. You cannot unilaterally change the terms and conditions of employee and say you must take this test. That's a violation of the fundamental rights of contract law. And that's what social dialogue is all about. And I don't care who the employer is. You cannot unilaterally change the terms of a condition of employee for those employees. When you hire them, you did not require them to take a test. You did not require them to have a vaccine. So how do you solve the problem, Jerome? That's what the tripartite council is for. That's what social dialogue here is all about.
So, Sharon, I've got to ask you, are the unions open to that kind of dialogue? Because the reality is, and let's face it, if we don't get this under control, if we don't do something to mitigate these waves and the strains that come on, we are going to be in dire consequences. People aren't going to come here if they don't feel safe. People can't go to work if they're sick, and we're going to overwhelm the healthcare system. We're facing some very critical very critical decisions. You know, what's the union's position? Are you willing to come to the table to begin to compromise in some way so that we all can get through this?
So, Jerome, I think what we need to understand is that the makeup of the tripartite council allows us to be seated at the table. So, for instance, I'm one of the workers' reps. There are 4 of us that sits on the tripartite council. So we are in constant dialogue with government and the employer. We all sit at the table and we're all in agreement at this point that we understand the economic fallout. We are poised to ensure that the Bahamas rebounds. So we sit on the tripartite council and we're having this dialogue. It's not something that's out there and God, here today, gone tomorrow. No, we're in constant dialogue about the pandemic because and any other natural disaster for that fact, because going forward we need to have these recommendations and we need to have manuals and all this kind of stuff in place so that if God forbid we ever face anything, that we are prepared. All these things caught us unprepared. Let's be honest and real across the region and around the world. And so all through the pandemic, we worked. We would have met with the NIB as workers reps because occupational health and safety was at risk. Workers were getting ill on the job, and the disease was not recognized by the National Insurance Board because it's not in their law. And so now we've had to take it a bit further where we have sent that on to the Tripartite Council. And all of that now is mixed into the next Decent Work Country program that is slated to be signed on by Cabinet shortly. So work is being done.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. We're unfortunately out of time, but I do want to just say thank you. And when we have these kinds of discussions and we're able to understand and see and hear what you all are doing, it does tell myself and others out there that things are happening behind the scenes, and it's not just when we say when row day come, that you find out what's happening. So I thank you for the work that you're doing. It's very important. Keeping our workers safe at a time like this is very important. So I applaud you for the work that you are doing. Robert Farquharson, it's good to see you. He's been in the business longer than me. We go way back. So it's good to see you and see that you're still in the game. It's important that people like you continue to keep up the work that you do. So thank you. Sharon Martin, thank you as well for coming on.
Thanks.
That's going to do it for this week's episode of On the Record. Special thanks to all of my guests, union representatives as well, for joining me, to my technical and production crew. Many thanks. And of course to you, our audience. We couldn't do it without you. We'll see you again next week, same place, same time, right here on The Record.